Friends, hello. Thank you for coming. My name is Brian McIntosh, and I belong to the three co-sponsoring organizations that are putting on this public forum on climate change, namely Etobicoke Climate Action, ECULINKS, Etobicoke, and KAIROS Toronto West. It's great to have you all here tonight. I'll be your moderator for the first part of the evening, and then my colleague and namesake, Brian MacLean, will moderate the discussion with you to come a little later. Just so you know, the washrooms are at the bottom of the stairs here where most of you came in. Make a U-turn to the right. And then there's a men's and women's washroom, respectively, through the back door of this room. Oh, there goes the arm. That's my fault. Sorry. We gave you a faulty chair. Sorry. Yes. And you'll find the washrooms on the middle level down a set of stairs at either end of the hallway right behind us. The name Etobicoke. Oh, and I should say, turn off your phones if you haven't already, please. We're recording this event to share it later on websites of our organizations and elsewhere. So it'd be good to not have interruptions. That would be great. Thank you. The name Etobicoke, if you didn't know, originates with the Mississauga First Nation, who called Etobicoke Creek and the area around it Etobicoke, meaning where the alders grow. The Mississaugas had moved from the Mississauga River area on Lake Huron to the North Shore on Lake Ontario around 1700. And so tonight, of course, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I would like to introduce our speakers for tonight. We have the Councillor for Etobicoke Lakeshore, Morley. We have the MP for Etobicoke Lakeshore, James Maloney. Right. And we have the MP for Etobicoke Centre, Yvan Baker. We thank them all for their time. And we have a climate campaigner with Toronto Environmental Alliance, How-Seng, Chong. So thank you for being here. I would also like to acknowledge the Etobicoke Centre Councillor Stephen Holliday expressed his regrets that he would be unable to join us due to a prior engagement tonight. And unfortunately, Etobicoke Lakeshore MPP Christine Hogarth and Etobicoke Centre MPP Kinga Surma both chose not to respond to our invitation to attend. Before I turn the floor over to our speakers, I want to briefly outline our purpose for the evening. If you didn't know already, COP28, which stands for Conference of Parties, the 28th meeting, started yesterday in Dubai. And this annual UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is a conference that convenes world leaders, civil society, indigenous peoples, faith communities, and others to advance action on addressing the climate emergency globally. In line with that objective, our goal tonight is to start building a base for further cooperative discussion and engagement among the citizens, businesses, and politicians in Etobicoke Lakeshore and Etobicoke Centre concerning how we can work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the two major contributors to greenhouse gases here in Etobicoke and elsewhere across the city and the region and everywhere, namely transportation and buildings. So working together is the overarching theme for tonight. On that note, I would like to read you a brief quote from the Globe and Mail published on October 20th of this year from an article entitled Building Canada's Cleaner and Greener Energy Future. One of the biggest steps that everyone can take toward a smoother energy transition is to cooperate more, says Jacob Sadikman, partner and co-chair of the energy group at the Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt law firm in Toronto. There's a lot of goodwill and innovation, and there's capital available, and we're better off if everybody is willing to try to work together with existing industries, new technologies, realistic regulations that encourage transitions, he explains. An all-or-nothing approach isn't particularly helpful. There are going to be bumps in the road, but the best thing the public can do is to challenge our leaders to come up with practical, realistic policies that don't polarize people. At the end of the day, we're all in this transition to a green economy and world together. So friends, that's our theme for tonight, working together. If we look at Toronto, we see that 58% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from buildings, and 33% are from transportation. That's a total of 91%. So without a doubt, these are the two key topics for action in our suburban environment. We need to come up with a plan of action, working together across all levels of government, as well as with residents and the businesses in Etobicoke. There are some guiding principles that we suggest for Etobicoke as we go forward, which are as follows. Act early and urgently. Beware of dead ends. We need to avoid agenda hitching. The guiding principle should be to not let perfection be the enemy of the good. We need to work together to create a voice that all of Etobicoke's stakeholders feel they can trust to give advice on how to get all of our buildings and transportation to net zero. The solution will not be one size fits all. And lastly, align our efforts in Etobicoke with the guidance offered by the Net Zero Advisory Body. And ultimately, friends, this is about us together as people in our area. We need to work together to assure that the residents of Etobicoke are aware of this emergency and want to treat it as an emergency, as it is. We need to make sure that politicians at all three levels of government treat this with the sense of urgency demanded by the people who elected them. And we want to make sure that private enterprise sees this as an opportunity to succeed in the transition, doing business to make buildings and transportation green. We believe will create massive opportunities to succeed in business. So the rest of our agenda looks like this for the evening. Each of our invited guests will speak for about 7 minutes. Cora will be our timekeeper over here. They've been warned. And no jeering or anything when they go a little bit over. And we'll use green, yellow at 1 minute and red one out of time. Then there will be a moderated discussion between our panelists, and that will take place for about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, tops. And we'll then have questions from the audience for 15 minutes. And this portion, we will work well together if we abide by the suggestion that your brief questions are welcome, but your grandstanding or long commentaries are not. We're taking a chance with you tonight. Please abide by those suggestions. We'll then brainstorm for about 10 minutes for some next steps to take for action that we might agree on together as individuals or groups or all together. And finally, we'll wrap up our discussion. So with that, please let me introduce Councillor Amber Morley, and she will be first. There are 2 mics there, you just turn it on and you're ready to go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to remain seated as I think it's going to be more of a casual living room style conversation together. But I'm very pleased to be joining you here tonight. As was mentioned, I am the city councillor for Etobicoke Lakeshore Ward 3, and was fairly recently appointed deputy mayor for Etobicoke as well, by our new mayor, Olivia Chow. So very excited to be taking on this role, and as part of my job as your representative, I sit on a couple of really fun, for me, and interesting related committees to the conversation we're having tonight. And the two that come top of mind are the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. I sit as a member of the executive, as well as a member of the Watershed Alliance. As we know, we're a waterfront community in Etobicoke Lakeshore. We've got tons of streams, creeks, and ravines that flow through down into our river. And so the protection of our water source is something that is not only our statutory responsibility at the City of Toronto, but it's something that I take very seriously and am passionate about the preservation, stewardship, and protection of our natural world. The other committee that I sit on, which is loads of fun, is the Infrastructure and Environment Committee at the City of Toronto. And many of the green initiatives, including our Toronto Green Standards, our Transform TO work, and cycling lanes and complete streets, and all kinds of other related initiatives flow through our Infrastructure and Environment Committee. And so I'm very proud and privileged to have a front row seat as part of that work and be informing the way forward as your representative at City Hall. So just this past week at Infrastructure and Environment Committee, we were tackling issues around single-use plastics, which we know there's been some recent changes in the news that the Supreme Court, I believe, overturned the federal ban. And so we're looking to see what we can continue to do as a municipality to show leadership and to promote a turn away from single-use plastics, as we know they can be really, really harmful and just have such an impact on the trash, litter, and landfills and all of the things that we need to continue to move away from. So those are some of the things I'm very excited about. I did get elected with a strong mandate around complete streets, and it's something that I have continued to be pretty strong in. I know there's been some pain points and a little bit of challenge in the neighborhood around the new installation of complete streets on floor, including the protected bike lanes. And so we are in daily conversation with residents, on both sides of the issue, and continue to work very closely with staff in our Transportation Services Department on this issue. As we heard from Brian, it really requires us at this time to be bold and courageous in our policy making, in our governance, if we hope to get on top of this issue. We've gotten a failing grade so far in terms of our progress as it relates to managing our greenhouse gas emissions and working to bring the temperature of the earth down. We really do need to take this work incredibly seriously. We're also in the process of our budget. Lots of budget pressures at the City of Toronto right now. And under the leadership of our new Mayor, Olivia Chow, there's been a really intentional community consultation process as we move through this budget, because it's going to be a difficult one. And one of the things I'm really proud of and have heard consistently at budget consultations, we've done 12 consultations so far publicly, and those conversations will continue. We're also doing informal budget reviews with all of the various agencies and divisions of the city. And one of the things that we've heard loud and clear at every single one of those budget consultations from citizens like you is the importance of our climate, the urgency of this crisis, and the need for us to take bold action to address it. And so I'm really proud and feel really heartened and encouraged by those comments and that sentiment from our citizens in Toronto. The other thing that I do that's sort of related, certainly very much related, is I sit on the Board of Health. And so the Board of Health more talks about our, obviously, health, which our climate is directly related to. But one of the things we were tackling earlier this week as well, as we launched our new strategy, Our Health, Our City, is the mental health challenges that our young people are experiencing. The rate of them is quite significant. And the climate-specific anxiety that young people are having is a very real thing that is troubling our young people today. And so I know as a very active and involved young person how important it is to see leadership and real action from people in positions of power to give us hope that we're going somewhere better than we are right now, and that we have a chance to overcome some of these really severe challenges. But I am very hopeful, I am very optimistic, and I know the incredible leaders, advocates on the stage with me here today are focused on this issue. We're all working really hard at our levels of government, and change is happening. But your voices, your participation really is important to keep us on the right track, and to ensure that we're making the right kinds of choices for a better, greener, more sustainable future. So I will leave it at that. I look forward to answering your questions and engaging in the conversations tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber. Our next speaker is MP Maloney.
Okay, so we're going south to north, and we're going to continue with the Etobicoke Lakeshore. Look, first of all, thanks very much for having me here. We're all here because we care about the same thing. I just want to get personal for a second. I've lived in Etobicoke since I was 11 years old. I went to Michael Power High School. I've driven by this church conservatively 500 times. And I'm embarrassed to say it's the first time I've ever set foot in here. I have 3 very good friends who I went to high school with who just live across the street on Neil, or some of them, their families still live there, so I'm just justified making it worse, I suppose.
I live on Neil.
Well, okay, so now I have 4 very good friends who live on here. There we go, okay, fantastic. Look, it's important we're here, and I want to thank you for hosting this event and all the organizations who are participating in this, particularly on a miserable night like tonight, coming out and joining us. But it's important, and it's important, we should take note of who is here, but I will say we should take note of who isn't here. And those of us who run for office, I'll just say this as clearly as I can, are used to having an empty chair on the stage when we have these discussions. And that's not acceptable, because climate change and the issues we're here to talk about tonight aren't partisan issues. They're issues that we all have to deal with, and they're issues that we should sort of put our red, blue, orange colors down, federal, provincial, municipal, and just sort of sit down and say, okay, what do we got to do? That's the utopian view, that's not the reality. Yvan and I work in Ottawa, day in and day out, and all you have to do is watch Question Period every day now between 2 and 3. I would actually discourage you from doing it, because it's not a positive reflection on our democracy at all. But if you do watch it, you're going to hear 60% of the questions from the opposition now on climate change. But the question isn't, why aren't you doing more? It's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. It's variations of the same question. So every day the Prime Minister and our Cabinet gets up in the House of Commons, and we have this debate about whether or not we should be doing something. And you've all heard it, you've seen the commercials on TV, you've seen the Leader of the Opposition. Now, I don't want to get partisan here, but there's a very important point to be made here. If the opposition, and I've had discussions with people who are passionate about this subject, that you're not doing enough. You need to do more. And I don't disagree, because we always need to do more. We know where we need to end up. The problem is, if what happens in the next election is what I fear might happen, you're going to have all empty chairs up here. Because Yvan and I won't be here as MPs to defend, the issues that we're here to talk about. I didn't intend to get into that, but I did. Anyway, look, I jotted down a whole number of things we need to talk about. We're talking about transportation and buildings. I was elected in 2015. From 2015 to 2021, I was the chair of our Natural Resources Committee. So I was thinking about today, I actually looked up, because I remember all of the studies we did at the Natural Resource Committee, and I went back and looked at all the reports we generated during those periods of time. And almost all of them were about climate resiliency, how we make the transition, how we do it, how we change people's attitudes, what we can do with infrastructure. And, I've forgotten about many of these reports, frankly, because it's a number of years ago, but there's a lot of good material in there. But one of the things we did talk about was buildings. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what a significant contribution, buildings made to to the climate. And so one of the studies we did was talking about greening buildings in the federal government's responsibility in our buildings. Because the amount of emissions is quite staggering. A friend of mine who used to work with in my previous life, he worked for an insurance company about 20 some years ago. He quit his job and he started a business. The business was to go out and help companies convert to become greener in their buildings. You're crazy, what are you doing? You've got a great job, you've been at it for a number of years. He was way ahead of the curve. So the first thing I did when we did one of these studies at Natural Resources, I called Jim, I said, can you come and give evidence? And he came and it was very, very helpful. But it's a significant issue, and it's an issue here in Etobicoke, because look, Etobicoke's old, there's a lot of older buildings, and this is something that we need to focus a lot of attention to. New buildings, and I'll look at Amber. Amber and I used to work together at City Hall, by the way, so we're very good friends. But you look at all you need to do is drive around, any part of Etobicoke, and there's cranes and construction. Drive down Dundas, Cloverdale, Honeydome Mall, all those things we used to see when I was a kid. So it's all being turned into condos. So we have an opportunity there, to green these buildings, to build net zero buildings. I think every single one of those buildings, it should be mandatory that there's EV charging stations in the parking lots of those buildings. There's no excuse for that not happening. In terms of retrofitting older buildings we'll talk about Etobicoke, same thing. That's a more expensive proposition, but this is where governments can collaborate, all three levels of government work together and try to transition these old buildings so that they do comply, and that 68% goes down to 6.8%. The transportation piece, they go hand in hand with what I'm talking about. We have more EV charging. Okay, I carried away there. Look, we're by 2035, every car built in Canada is going to be an electric car. We've got net zero targets by 2035. I'm sure Yvan and I tonight will talk about federal government investment in Stellantis and Volkswagen in Ontario. We're reviving the auto sector in Ontario, which has kept this province going for such a long period of time, but in a way that reflects the things that we're here to talk about tonight. The last piece I just want to touch on is Etobicoke is on the shore of Lake Ontario. The Great Lakes represent a massive opportunity to reduce carbon emissions. I challenge you to go sit on the side of the 401 between here and Oshawa during rush hour and count the number of trucks. It is staggering. We have an opportunity to enhance our transportation system by moving more freight by water. It reduces the carbon footprint exponentially. It's a resource that is underutilized, and it's something we need to focus on, and I know I'm going to get time, so thanks.
Thank you, James, and over to our other federal MP, Yvan Baker.
Great. Well, Brian, thanks so much for having me. And thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. Many of you I know well. Many of you I've met with before. Some of you have got to know tonight, but I thank you all for being here. It shows your commitment to this issue, and really, really appreciate that. Some of you I know I've had the chance to meet with, some of you on many occasions to talk about environmental policy, and many of those conversations have originated with you because you wanted to advocate with me for us to do more or better than what we're doing, and I appreciate that advocacy, and so thank you all for your work and for being here tonight. I'm also looking forward, frankly, to the third part of the agenda because, look, I'm looking forward to hearing, so many of you are incredibly knowledgeable. I know that from personal experience. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments and suggestions as well. So quickly, I'll just say it's great to be back here. Brian, thanks for hosting us here. And I will say that just earlier this afternoon, I was at one of our local public schools visiting a civics class, and grade 5 civics class. And at the school, I was talking about what an member of Parliament does, and how I get elected, and how people make those choices. And so I asked the students, I said, well, if you were voting, how would you decide who to vote for? And a young lady, a girl, raises her hand, and I said, yes, and she says, pollution. And I share that story with you because that is representative of what I get in every grade 5 civics class I visit, right? This is fighting climate change is one of the number one issues I hear about, which says two things to me. One is, if the grade 5 students understand how urgent it is, we all need to understand how urgent it is. But also, I think what it shows is that the future is bright on this issue in that, and it doesn't just apply to grade 5, it applies to young people that I meet with across all ages, that for them, this is a very high priority. And so, so the future is bright in the sense that I think as we go forward, we'll have more and more support from Canadians to take action on climate change. With that said, I think James kind of gave an overview of some of the things that he sees as needing to be done, a little bit of the political overview. What I thought I would just do is kind of do a quick summary of some of the things that the federal government's doing. The list is very long, and I couldn't do it in 7 minutes. But what I wanted to do was just talk about a few of the key measures. So, when the federal government took office in 2015, our emissions, Canada's emissions were projected to increase above 2005 levels by 2030. Now we're committed. The federal government has committed to reducing our emissions by 40 to 45% below the 2005 levels by 2030. Okay, so it was expected to be above. Now it's going to be, we're committed to 40% below. And so in terms of how we're doing against that, we're on track right now. So we're not quite there yet. We're on track to reduce our emissions 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. But we've committed to doing additional things to make sure we get to at least that 40%, if not further. And we're also on track to achieve our interim commitment of 20% below 2005 levels by 2026, right? So that's 3 years from now. And so if you look at the National Inventory Report, which documents how Canada's doing, we're below, we reduced emissions by 62 megatons, that's 8.4% below 2005 levels as of 2021. Okay, there's a lot of numbers here, but basically we're 8% below 2005 levels. That was in 2021. And we're also 7.4% below the pre-pandemic emissions levels. Gives you a sense of where we're going, how we're tracking against that. We've still got a little bit of work to do, but we're close to being on track for that 40% reduction, and how much we've done, where we are today. The biggest components or some of the biggest policy contributors to that is price on pollution, and it's planned to be responsible for about a third of our emissions reduction target for price and pollution between 2005 and 2030. So that's one. Two, clean fuel regulations. So basically, it just means we want to make sure that the fuels we are using are less polluting. And the regulations, the clean fuel regulations are coming into force on January 1st, 2024, so very shortly. Number three is moving to a net zero grid. Moving our electricity grid towards net zero emissions. So draft regulations were published in August, and again, the goal here is to get to net zero electricity grid by 2035. We're planning to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. And Brian mentioned the COP conference, which is happening now in Dubai. I don't have inside information, but from what's in public sources, my understanding is that this is one of the things that you can expect. I expect our government to be speaking more about at this conference over the coming days. In other words, what are the specifics of our plan to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector? And the fifth piece is ensuring that all new vehicles, and James alluded to this, all new vehicles must be electric by new vehicles sold in Canada must be electric by 2035, and the regulations that will specify exactly how we're defining all of that will be done by the end of this year, end of 2023.
Does that include anything about the infrastructure to serve those electric vehicles?
It may. I don't have inside information as to what it looks like, but that's good feedback. I expect it will, but I can't say that I know for sure. But that has to be done, regardless whether it's part of those regulations or separately. And we've made huge investments in electricity grids, and I'm not even listing all of that, but certainly that's an important point, Brian. How much time do I have left? How am I doing?
1 minute.
1 minute, good time, perfect. So I think the last thing I'll say is that, James talked about the politics of the day. I think what I want to say is something a little bit, I agree with everything James said, by the way, but in addition to what James said, I would say, I think we have to expect that in this country there are going to be changeovers in governments over time. I certainly hope not in the next federal election for the reasons James outlined, but there are going to be changeovers. We live in a democracy. and there are going to be different complements of members of parliament elected. So one of the things that I think that we did, and I had the privilege of working on as a member of the Environment Committee, I'm not a member of the Environment Committee today, but I was the Net Zero Accountability Act in 2021, which was passed in Parliament. And basically this, I'm going to summarize, basically what this does is this obligates the Government of Canada, no matter who's in power, to set up targets that we have to meet in terms of emissions every 5 years until 2050. And then it requires us to report on how we're doing, and if we miss those targets, we have to report on why we missed them and what we're going to do to fix them. So it's meant as an accountability mechanism for us, which is, I think, a very healthy thing, but I think it's an accountability mechanism that's important for future governments, so that the resolve to meet those targets by 2050 is done. Last thing I'll say is, this is the existential issue of our time, so I think it's important that we do what it takes to get to those targets, but I also agree with something that Brian said at the outset, which is, I think we've got to find a way, and this is all of us together and working together using that theme, of finding a way to make sure that we're bringing, that we have a broad consensus in this country as to how to move forward on all this. Because the worry I have is if we don't have that, then we risk electing a government who rolls back a lot of what we've done. And good luck meeting those targets if that happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvan. And lastly, we have our climate campaigner from Toronto Environmental Alliance, How-Seng Chong. Are those mics working?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody here, for being here, and thank you all as well. Similarly, I have driven by here and walked with friends of mine who used to go to Silver and Thorn and stuff past this building through the creek all the time, and I've never been in this building before. So yeah, I grew up with, I also, it looks like we got split between the Lakeshore people and the center people, because I grew up also in Etobicoke Center. I actually went to school, my high school was in Martin Grove, but I did go to school at Broadacres, not far from here as well. Back in the days when Etobicoke was its own city before amalgamation, which was in '97. I've been a climate activist for about 20 years, more than 20 years actually. I started off mostly at the university level. But one of the things when I look back is to my childhood here, because Etobicoke and Toronto and Canada as a whole has had, a lot of people must know this, a very long and storied leadership position in the past on environment and climate issues. Etobicoke was one of the first places to have a blue box program in the world. Etobicoke was one of the first places in the GTHA to have a green bin program for organics. In 1988, one of the very first global conferences that said, hey, we need to cut our emissions happened here in Toronto, happened in Downsview. A lot of people don't necessarily recognize this. In 1988, Canada was considered a global leader, and to your point, that was a conservative government. That was the Maloney years, and his former environment minister once talked about. There's a video somewhere online. I keep trying to find this video. Someone may have taken it down for political reasons, perhaps. But he said that when they went to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, they were treated as rock stars. Like the Canadian delegation was treated as rock stars because we were leading on acid rain. We were leading on ozone depleting chemicals, the Montreal Protocol that was signed in 1987. And we were one of the key globally important international negotiators that pushed for the UNFCCC, for an actual global climate treaty. So there's a history across, in Canada that has happened across party lines over time. And unfortunately, we've lost a lot of that leadership. Other people have surpassed us. And it's not the fault of one government, it's the fault of multiple governments of different parties at the federal level and the provincial level and municipal level. There's multiple reasons for it, but one of the fascinating things about living in democracy is that we have the power as individuals and as communities to actually push for these types of changes when the ballots are coming, but also at events like this, at City Hall, for example, and at community events, or just talking to your friends and family. I want to talk a little bit about the personal challenge that I have had being a climate activist for almost 25 years. Because I've been yelling about this for 25 years, and then the floods happened in Toronto, and lots of my friends in Etobicoke, their families grew up, their basements were flooded in 2013. Some of you may have remembered that massive flood that occurred when we had about 200 millimeters of rain fall within a 48-hour period, which is more than came down during Hurricane Hazel in the 1950s. And of course, this past summer, when we see all this smoke and feel like we can't go anywhere, it can be really, really heartbreaking and really frustrating, especially as someone who's been doing this for 20 years. So people sometimes ask me, how can you keep doing this? How are you still working on this? And the answer that I give often is, even though the science around climate change has never been more dire, like the world's never been hotter, the air's never been worse, there's never been more oil and gas being burned, the actual challenge, there's a scientist somewhere, somebody at some point said, God gave physicists the easy questions. Because when you're measuring, planets and atoms and things like that, and like temperature and water, it's a measurement that's relatively easy to figure out. But what's difficult is what people do and societies do. And we in this room, as people who are concerned, who are acting on climate change, are part of a global movement of at least tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. This may be potentially the largest social movement, and some have argued this, that this may be the largest social movement humanity has ever seen. It is significant. And I'll give you an example of what types of things that we can achieve. While people like me have been trying to push back things like oil and gas projects and pipelines that certain federal governments purchased not that long ago, sorry, I can't get into that. I worked very, very hard on the Trans-Mountain Pipeline campaign, and we can talk about that later. I don't want to embarrass folks too much. And I know it wasn't your decision, you're on cabinet, but anyway. It's also, like, while all these things are happening, I think it's vital to see that, like, there are all these people working on this issue everywhere. And so while, people like me have been pushing back on, like, projects that we think are bad for the environment, there's been people like developing electric cars and heat pumps. Just 5 years ago, if you had asked me if it was possible to go en masse carbon-free buildings in, like, I would tell you, no, there's no possible way. The only thing you can do is improve a building's insulation. But that's no longer the case, because now we have cold weather heat pumps that are affordable for a larger and larger chunk of society. And so while there are people like me, kind of like on the outside pushing against decision makers and trying to get decision makers to do the right thing and trying to give them political cover and all that type of stuff, there's also been this other group of people who have been trying to, like, get the technical aspects right and get the social aspects right and get the rights and making sure that people aren't harmed. And so I want people to recognize that we are not alone here. No one here is alone. I think we all have a fantastic opportunity here to really push forward on this. So I want to speak also a little bit briefly about the power of fighting climate change in Toronto. As someone who grew up here, I get that Toronto, may have like a slight inferiority complex, but we are 20% of the GDP in Canada. We are 50% of the GDP in Ontario, and we are the center of almost 40% of the Canadian population who lives in Southern Ontario. Things that changed here, I was on a call today with some colleagues from Windsor and Hamilton, and they said this without me prodding them. Things we changed here have an effect in other municipalities across Ontario and across Canada. And so I'll just leave you with that. We do have a lot of power here. We have the leadership capability. Canada and Toronto has led before, and we can do it again.
Thank you, How-Seng. So we want want to have a discussion now that's a little more about our two key challenges. We've heard a lot of sort of opening remarks, general remarks, political remarks, and so on, but we want to focus on buildings for the first part of this little discussion among the four of you, and then on transportation for the second part. So for buildings, there seems